On a sweltering August day in the year 1572, the city of Paris was shrouded in a thick, oppressive haze that seemed almost suffocating. The air was laden with a potent mixture of foul odours, stale excrement, the scent of sweat from countless bodies, and an intoxicating aroma wafting from the gardens of the Louvre. This heavy atmosphere trembled with an undercurrent of barely contained tension, as if the very city itself sensed the impending upheaval. It was a day destined to be etched into history, marking a union forged from a calamitous blend of ambition, faith, and treachery. In the sacred halls of the Notre Dame Cathedral, the stone heartbeat of Catholic France, two figures were about to be joined in matrimony. Margaret de Valois, the sister of King Charles I, and Henry de Bourbon, a young and charismatic king of Navarre. This wedding, meticulously orchestrated by Queen Mother Catherine de Medici, was intended to symbolize an eternal peace, a golden bridge set across the bloody chasm of over a decade of religious warfare. Yet, from the perspective of the Parisian masses, who watched with a mixture of disdain and malice, this union appeared not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as an act of heresy, an abomination that betrayed centuries of strife. The ceremony itself was riddled with contradictions. The groom, a known heretic, waited outside on the church's porch while his Catholic bride listened solemnly from within, isolated during the service. Courtly smiles, carefully painted on aristocratic faces, masked underlying hostility, polite gestures concealing cold, unwavering hatred. To the Catholics, the Huguenots were rebellious heretics, desecrators of sacred temples and icons. Conversely, the Protestants saw the Catholics as agents of Rome's tyranny, pawns of the Spanish oppressor whose cruelty knew no bounds. No one yet realized that this marriage, proclaimed as a step toward peace, would ignite a subsequent massacre that would stain French history forever. As days passed, the wedding bells would be replaced by ominous calls for murder, and the bed of rose petals strewn before the ceremony would soon be soaked in blood. The festive scene would give way to a night of slaughter, ultimately known as the St. Bartholomew's Night, a dark symbol of religious fanaticism and political betrayal, a bloody scar on France's soul that would bleed for centuries to come. Understanding how such madness became possible in the heart of Paris by the summer of 1572 requires delving into the deeper roots of the fissures that tore France apart. Decades earlier, the kingdom had been the most populous, prosperous, and influential nation of Christian Europe. Yet beneath its shining surface, fundamental contradictions simmered, ready to erupt violently at any moment. These deep-seated conflicts originated across the Rhine River in the German lands, sparked by the revolutionary teachings of Martin Luther. However, for France, the decisive influence came from another figure, its own son, John Calvin. Calvin, a native of Picardy and trained as a lawyer, transformed the reformist ideas into a coherent, relentless system of thought that would shape a new religious movement. His teachings became the blueprint of Protestantism, which, in France, was known as Huguenotism. Unlike the elaborate rituals of Catholic worship, Calvin's doctrine emphasized austerity, intellectual rigor, and a focus on personal faith. It rejected the authority of the Pope, the veneration of saints, and the sacraments, all of which he and his followers saw as unbiblical innovations. From his headquarters in Geneva, a city often called the Protestant Rome, Calvin directed the spread of his faith across Europe, and his doctrines found fertile ground within France's diverse and restless population. His Calvinism encouraged a strict moral code, a sense of divine predestination, and an uncompromising attitude toward ecclesiastical authority. It was these ideas that would ignite the flames of civil war, creating a deep divide that split the kingdom into factions, Catholics and Protestants, each seeking to impose their vision of divine justice and social order. He preached humility, diligent work, and the idea of divine predestination, emphasizing that each person's fate was ultimately determined by divine will. Initially, the French monarchs, Francis I and his son Henry II, viewed this new doctrine with a certain level of tolerance, considering it more an intellectual curiosity or historical trend rather than a serious threat. They regarded it as a philosophical or theological debate rather than a challenge to their authority. However, as the ranks of Protestants grew larger and more organised, the Crown's attitude shifted and concern began to mount. The notorious incident of Adnar Tisica Patsot Treachery, when Protestant pamphlets and leaflets were plastered all over Paris streets and even pasted on the doors of the royal apartments at Vauban, marked the end of patience and leniency. This event ignited the first wave of repression, leading to the establishment of the fiery chamber of Inquisition, or the Chambre Ardente, tasked with prosecuting heretics. Public burnings and executions followed, the flames of the bonfires lighting up the night. Yet, as often happens in such turbulent times, these harsh measures only served to deepen the faith of the persecuted and attract new converts to the cause. By the middle of the 16th century, Protestantism, or Huguenot faith, as it was called in France, ceased to be solely the religious pursuit of a small group of intellectuals and townspeople. It began to spread rapidly among the aristocracy, particularly within noble circles. This development posed a grave threat to the monarchy's authority, for many noble lords saw Calvinism not just as a religious conviction, but also as a strategic tool, an ideology that could serve as a means to challenge the central power of the king. It offered the possibility to resist tyranny, seize church lands, and bolster their own independence from royal control. The Huguenot Church in France was remarkably well organised. It maintained secret cells within its synods, held clandestine meetings and synods, and collected resources clandestinely. Most notably, it possessed the ability to mobilise thousands of armed noblemen, elite warriors of Europe, at a moment's notice, ready to fight for their faith and their rights. This fragile balance of power in France was abruptly upset in the year 1559. During a tournament organised to celebrate his daughter's wedding, King Henry II received a mortal wound. He was struck in the eye by a fragment of a lance. His death was a catastrophe for France, plunging the kingdom into chaos. Following his demise, the throne was successively occupied by his sons, children of Catherine de Medici. First came the weak and ailing Francis II, then the young and indecisive Charles IX, and finally Henry II, each lacking the strength and resolve to maintain stable rule. The monarchy's authority waned, creating a power vacuum into which the ambitions of the great noble clans flooded eagerly, each eager to seize influence over the young king. The political stage in France quickly coalesced around three formidable factions. The first was the ultra-Catholic party, led by the powerful and ambitious House of Guise. François de Guise, a brilliant military leader celebrated for recapturing Calais from the English, and his brother Cardinal Charles, known as the Cardinal of Lorraine, effectively held the reins of power during Francis II's reign. They were ardent Catholics, supported by Spain and the papacy, and saw the Huguenots as a deadly threat that could only be eradicated with iron and fire. The second group was the Calvinist faction, headed by representatives from two of France's most noble houses. The first was the House of Bourbon, princely relatives of the reigning Valois dynasty, with Antoine de Bourbon as its leader, weak, indecisive, and susceptible to influence. However, his younger brother, Prince Louis de Condé, was a dynamic and ambitious leader eager to expand his influence. The second influential family was the House of Montmorency-Châtillon, a noble lineage that also had vested interests in the political and religious upheavals sweeping across the kingdom. The head of this lineage, the venerable Connétable Anton Montmorency, remained a devout Catholic throughout his life. However, his three nephews, brothers of the Châtillon family, adopted the unwavering faith of the Huguenots, with the most prominent among them being Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Meanwhile, a third, more moderate force operated within France, represented by the centrist or political party to which Queen Mother Catherine de Medici belonged. This political faction was not driven by a desire to see one religion triumph over the other, but rather aimed at maintaining peace across a fractured country. Paramount among its goals was the preservation and stabilization of royal authority. Catherine and her chancellor, Michel de l'Hôpital, sought to implement a politique of religious tolerance, skillfully maneuvering between the two hostile camps that emerged within the kingdom. Yet, in the year 1662, this fragile peace shattered dramatically. Violence erupted when a contingent led by François Guizet attacked worshippers at the Huguenot congregation in the town of Vassy. The brutal massacre at Vassy ignited a wave of violence that swept through the entire realm, sparking the first of 8 devastating wars of religion that would plague France for more than 30 years. These wars were terror-inducing and chaotic, where fanaticism intertwined with personal ambitions, and skirmishes frequently culminated in treacherous murders. During this turbulent period, François Guizet was slain by a noble Huguenot, and Prince Condé perished at the Battle of Jarnac. France descended into chaos and disorder. After each conflict, another temporary treaty was brokered, an uneasy truce that was often broken shortly thereafter. For a moment, it seemed that France had a real chance at long-awaited stability after the signing of the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. However, this peace turned out to be merely a pause before the most horrific storm yet. At the heart of this turmoil, on the politically charged stage, riddled with hatred and treachery, stood a woman whose name soon became synonymous with slyness and treachery, who cast a shadow over the tragedy of the St. Bartholomew's night. It was Catherine de Medici. But who was she truly? Was she a murderous puppet master, delighting in plunging Paris into the blood of heretics, as black legends suggest, spun by Huguenot pamphleteers? Or a tragic figure desperately striving to save her crown and her children amid a collapsing kingdom, caught in her own web of schemes? Her life was marked from the very beginning by tragedy and struggle. Catherine Maria Romola di Laurence de Medici was born in 1519 in Florence, into the family of Lorenzo II de Medici, the ruler of Florence, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French aristocrat. She was descended from a renowned lineage of Florentine bankers and patrons of the arts, yet in France, her noble blood was often viewed as that of a common merchant, unworthy of royal status. Orphaned at a very young age, she lost her parents within her first month of life. From that moment, the young Duchess of Chaos became a pawn in the grand game of Italian politics, held hostage by rival factions vying for power. At the age of 14, her uncle, Pope Clement VI, arranged her marriage to Henry, the second son of King Francis I of France, who later became King Henry II. The marriage was far from happy. The young Florentine girl, arriving in France with a generous dowry, was met with cold indifference and contempt. Matters worsened after her husband unexpectedly ascended the throne and became King Henry II. Her situation grew even more humiliating as Henry himself was madly in love with his mistress, the dazzling Diana de Poitiers, who was 20 years his senior. Throughout her turbulent life, Catherine was shaped by grief, political intrigue, and the relentless struggle to carve a place for herself amidst the shifting sands of power. Diana was truly the Queen of France. She embodied regal dignity and authority, while Catherine, in stark contrast, was nothing more than a humbled wife whose sole duty was to bear heirs. For a decade, Catherine remained infertile, an uncertainty that hung over her like a dark cloud, constantly threatening the stability of her marriage and her status, with the ever-present possibility of divorce looming overhead. Then, as if touched by a stroke of magic, she suddenly began giving birth to children one after another, first one, then another, until she had borne 10 offspring, of whom 7 survived, including 4 boys. She fulfilled her maternal duty, but these long years of humiliation, neglect, and emotional hardship had forged her character in the crucible of adversity. Throughout this brutal period, she learned to mask her true feelings behind an impermeable facade, becoming adept at concealment, patience, and cunning intrigue, trusting no one and forging her own path through the treacherous political landscape. Her sole passion and unwavering focus became wielding power, not for her personal gain, but for the sake of her children and the preservation of the Lorraine dynasty. When in the year of King Henry II's untimely death, she, now a widow, clad in black mourning attire, finally stepped out of the shadows. It marked a turning point. Catherine swiftly removed Diana de Poitiers from the court sphere of influence and took control of affairs as regent, wielding authority in her son's name. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she was not a devout fanatic of religion. Instead, her upbringing in the intellectual and humanist atmosphere of Florence had imbued her with a pragmatic outlook and keen political sensibilities. She saw clearly that the religious schisms tearing France apart threatened her son's reign, endangering the very foundation of their power, so she genuinely endeavoured to seek compromise. Her political approach was characterised by moderation, the policy of the middle ground. She strove tirelessly to reconcile Catholics and Huguenots, organising theological debates and issuing edicts of religious tolerance. In 1651, she convened a colloquium at Poissy, inviting leading Catholic and Protestant theologians to find common understanding, but this effort failed as fanaticism from both sides refused to concede. The extremists on either end refused to budge, prompting her to adopt a shifting policy, alternating support between the rival factions in an attempt to prevent any one group from gaining overwhelming dominance. This approach, however, earned her universal suspicion and hostility. Ultra-Catholics, led by the Guises, regarded her as a supporter of heretics, while the Huguenots perceived her as a cunning Italian, ready at any moment to betray them. The court was filled with an atmosphere of mistrust, where espionage, informers, and conspiracies flourished under her rule. Catherine, herself intrigued by astrology and divination, sought visions of the future, attempting to peer into what lay ahead, but her efforts proved fruitless. Destiny remained elusive. By the year 1572, her policies seemed to have reached an impasse. The Peace of Saint-Germain, which ended the third of France's religious wars, appeared to be her last hope. She granted the Huguenots freedom of worship and ceded to them 4 fortified towns as guarantees of their security. The pinnacle of this peace was to be the marriage of her daughter Margaret to the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre, a union she envisioned not only as a means to reconcile the divided factions, but also to strengthen her dynasty and forge a formidable anti-Spanish alliance. Yet, at this critical juncture, a figure emerged who shattered her plans and forced her into an agonizing dilemma: the Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. It seemed at first glance that the Peace of Saint-Germain in 1570 marked a much-needed breather for France. A symbol of this new approach to governance and diplomacy was none other than Coligny himself, who, just the day before, had been considered her formidable adversary, an insurrectionist sentenced to death. Now, unexpectedly, he was appointed as the king's chief advisor, his mentor, and almost like a father figure. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Signory of Coligny, had risen from the depths of opposition to become the most influential figure at court, embodying a controversial but promising chapter in France's turbulent history. His re-entry into the royal court and the remarkable influence he wielded over young King Charles IX became the crucial catalysts that set in motion the events leading to the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Coligny epitomized the nobility of the Guignot aristocracy, a man descended from one of France's most illustrious and ancient noble families. His military career had begun with great promise, and he had distinguished himself as a brave warrior and a talented commander in the Italian wars. He held the titles of Governor of Picardy and Admiral of France, though the latter was primarily honorary and did not entail actual naval command. Unlike many of his noble peers who had adopted Calvinism out of political convenience, Coligny had come to his faith through profound personal conviction. His conversion was heartfelt and irrevocable, transforming him into a figure widely regarded as the conscience of the Reformation, a man known for strict morals, deep religious conviction, and unwavering resolve. After the death of Prince Condé in 1659, Coligny became the unchallenged leader of the Guignot faction, an assembly of devotees dedicated to their religious and political cause. Although he often suffered military defeats, he never conceded defeat in the broader struggle. Each setback only strengthened his resolve, and he proved capable of rallying his followers and continuing the fight. Following the conclusion of a period of civil unrest, this hardened and disciplined man, then aged by his battles and hardships, was summoned to the royal court, a move that stunned many and incited genuine fears in Queen Catherine de Medici. The young, impressionable, and uncertain King Charles IX, who was only 21, found himself completely captivated by Coligny's commanding presence. Having grown up amid the poisonous intrigues of court life, shadowed by the dominance of his formidable mother, Charles saw in the Admiral an ideal of masculinity and honour that he so desperately lacked. His admiration soon blossomed into a familial attachment, and he began calling Coligny his father. The two spent countless days together, hunting, discussing state affairs, forging a close bond. Meanwhile, Catherine's influence over her son visibly waned. After 13 years of wielding power over France, she suddenly found her position increasingly diminished as Charles immersed himself in the company of the Admiral. Coligny, meanwhile, harboured a bold and daring plan, one he subtly began whispering to the young king, a plan designed not only to end religious strife, but also to elevate France's status among nations. His conviction was that the only way to unite the divided factions, Catholics and Huguenots, was to channel their collective energy and martial spirit against a common external enemy. He identified Spain, ruled by King Philip II, as France's greatest adversary, a militant symbol of Catholic fanaticism across Europe. At this very moment, in the Netherlands, then under Spanish control, a Protestant uprising had erupted against Spanish dominance. Duke Alba, the Spanish governor, was ruthlessly quelling the rebellion, spilling blood across the land. Caligny proposed that King Charles IX intervene in this conflict by supporting the Dutch rebels and declaring war on Spain. The plan was deceptively simple, but profoundly strategic. A war against Spain would serve to unify the French nation. Nobles of the Guignot faction, experienced warriors, would gladly take up arms to defend their faith and ideals alongside their king. Catholic patriots, who detested Spanish hegemony and the fanaticism it embodied, would also rally to the cause. Victory in such a war promised to bring new territories to France's domain and elevate its reputation to unprecedented heights. However, for Catherine de Medici, this plan appeared utterly insane. She, more than anyone else, understood just how fragile and depleted France had become after a decade of bloody civil wars, the nation exhausted, impoverished, and divided. To her, the idea of risking further conflict with Spain, an empire then at the height of its power, seemed a dangerous and reckless gamble. Yet, despite her fears, she could not entirely dismiss Caligny's vision, which retained a certain undeniable allure to the ambitious young king. Beginning a war against the most powerful nation in the world, Spain, whose infantry was renowned for being invincibly formidable, was a reckless act that could only be described as suicidal. Such a course of action threatened to inevitably lead to France's defeat, the loss of its throne, and perhaps even its very independence. Moreover, it completely shattered the country's carefully maintained foreign policy doctrine, which was built upon preserving peaceful relations with Spain. Despite attempts by the Queen Mother to reason with her son, he, blinded by the influence of the Cardinal, Caligny, refused to listen or heed her warnings. It is said that he told her to leave him alone for at least 2 months, as he needed time to think. Tensions within the royal court reached a breaking point during this period, with hostility simmering just beneath the surface. Queen Catherine saw clearly that her admiral was guiding her son and, through him, steering the entire kingdom toward disaster. Meanwhile, the ultra-Catholic faction, led by Henri de Guise, the son of the slain François de Guise, thirsted for revenge. Henri de Guise openly accused Caligny of being behind his father's murder, seeking merely a pretext to settle personal scores. At the same time, the Spanish ambassador, Don Diego de Zúñiga, was weaving complex intrigues, encouraging the Catholic faction to take decisive action and informing the king himself that Caligny had ascended to the throne of France. The atmosphere around them grew increasingly tense, thick with suspicion and hostility. In the midst of this turbulent climate, the wedding of Margaret of Valois to Henry of Navarre, a union intended to symbolize peace and unity, was turning into a battleground of rival interests and conflicting ambitions. All the key players in this political drama had gathered in the same city, in the same venue, each driven by their own objectives. Unbeknownst to them, they were all hurtling toward a bloody confrontation that would change everything. The wedding, held on the 18th of August, marked the beginning of a week filled with grand, opulent celebrations, lavish banquets, and spectacular festivities, each more costly and elaborate than the last. Catherine de Medici, renowned for her love of spectacle and grandeur, sought to outdo her previous achievements, turning the event into a dazzling display of wealth and power. Paris was meant to witness the triumph of peace and the authority of the royal house of Valois. Yet, beneath the glitter of gold and silk, amid the roar of music and booming fireworks, concealed the growing hostility and resentment that threatened to erupt at any moment. The city at that time resembled a disturbed hive, packed with thousands of noblemen from various regions of the kingdom, each accompanied by their retinues, behaving loudly and provocatively, like conquerors returning home victorious. Their attire contrasted sharply. The strict black garments of the Guise faction starkly clashed with the bright, eye-catching attire of the Catholic courtiers. These nobles openly mocked Catholic rituals, ridiculing them as mere idol worship, which was an unendurable insult to the devout Parisian Catholics, whose fervent faith made such blasphemies intolerable. The Parisians harboured an intense hatred for the Guise nobles. This animosity was fueled by fiery sermons from radical priests who denounced the marriage between Protestants and Catholics as heretical, calling for vengeance and punishment against enemies of Christ. Rumours spread wildly through the city. It was said that the Guises intended to seize control, assassinate the king, and install their own prince, Condé, on the throne. Food prices soared, further fueling popular discontent and unrest. Meanwhile, within the walls of the royal palace, festivities continued unabated, with one ball, masquerade, or tournament following another, each more elaborate than the last. One particular allegorical performance, staged at the Bourbon court, turned out to be a sinister omen. It depicted Catholic princes symbolising the king and his brothers, defending heaven from the knightly forces of Henry of Navarre and his allies, forces that, in the allegory, were portrayed as Guise supporters and heretics. The scene suggested that these latter would ultimately be unworthy of salvation, doomed to descend into hell. This grim prophecy reflected the underlying tensions and the fragile veneer of peace, hinting that the seemingly festive occasion was on the brink of erupting into deadly violence. Huguenots had chuckled, dismissing it all as a mere joke, unaware of how close to the truth that jest truly was. The tension among the leaders of the factions had reached a boiling point, and every move was watched with a mixture of suspicion and hostility. Heinrich de Guise and Admiral Coligny, the prominent figures at the centre of the growing conflict, deliberately ignored each other, their mutual disdain simmering beneath the surface of formal politeness. At one of the official receptions, Guise publicly insulted a nobleman from Gouguineau, an act that nearly sparked a duel right there within the grand halls of the Louvre. The atmosphere grew increasingly volatile, and King Charles there, torn between his mother and Admiral Coligny, found himself slipping into bouts of nervous agitation and irritable outbursts. He would sometimes embrace the Admiral warmly, only moments later to strike out in anger as a storm of conflicting loyalties tore him apart internally. One particular day, while they were playing a game of ball, a furious quarrel erupted between the king and the admiral, ending with the monarch hastily declaring that he had made concessions, but soon would make Coligny acknowledge his superiority. Queen Catherine de Medici watched these turbulent events with growing anxiety, her hopes for reconciliation fading with each passing day. Instead of bringing peace, the wedding, initially seen as a union meant to mend fractured alliances, only fueled further resentment and hostility across the capital. Yet, amidst these tumultuous times, Coligny's ambitions refused to die. He continued to pressure the king, demanding an immediate declaration of war against Spain. Threateningly, he claimed that if the king failed to support him, the Huguenot nobles, under his command, would march themselves into Flanders to fight, no longer a mere suggestion, but an outright ultimatum. For Queen Catherine, this was the breaking point. Coligny had become dangerously powerful. He had usurped royal authority and was steering the nation steadily toward inevitable conflict. She knew that something had to be done to halt his rise. Master of covert intrigues, Catherine devised a daring plan. She found allies among the Guises, who hated Coligny with a fierce passion and eagerly sought his downfall. Perhaps, secretly, she gained the approval of her second son, Henry of Anjou, a young man brimming with ambition and brutality, an enthusiastic and ruthless supporter of her cause, and an ardent enemy of the admiral. The conspiracy was carefully woven. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. That moment arrived on Friday, the 22nd of August, in the year 1572. It was 4 days after the royal wedding, a day filled with tension. That morning, the royal council convened within the grand halls of the Louvre. Coligny, ever persistent, pressed the king for decisive action against Spain, his words sharp and determined. After the council adjourned, at approximately 1,100 hours, the admiral set off on foot from the Louvre towards his residence on the Rue Béthisy. Accompanying him was a small retinue of about a dozen noblemen, their faces tense and watchful. He carried with him a note, reading it as he went, his eyes flickering with purpose. As he passed by one of the houses belonging to a Guise's confidant, situated along his route, a sudden gunshot shattered the silence. From a barred window on the upper floor, a shot was fired, an arcing, deadly projectile. The bullet, emanating from an arquebus, shattered the admiral's index finger on his right hand and wounded his left forearm. Coligny staggered, unsteady but still standing, his voice rising amid the chaos, as he declared that such bloodshed was the bitter fruit of his loyalty to the king. His retinue rushed to his side, trying to help him as others burst into the house from which the shot had come. Yet, the attacker was already gone. The assassin, identified as Charles de Morville, a notorious mercenary known as the Killer of Kings, had managed to slip away amidst the turmoil. In the room, only the smoking remains of a watermelon, a symbol of the blinding hail of lead. Morville had fled through the back garden, where a saddle horse, prepared earlier in the stables of the Duke of Guise, awaited him. He rode swiftly out of sight, disappearing into the city's labyrinthine streets. News of the assassination attempt spread instantly across Paris. The wounded admiral was swiftly taken to his residence, his condition causing ripples of fear and fury among the hundreds of Guise's supporters gathered in the city. Crowds of noblemen, faces grim and hands clutching their swords, gathered in mourning outside his home, their eyes fixed on the house, fully convinced that Coligny's enemies had finally struck at him. No one doubted who was behind the attack. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and dread, fueling rumours that the peril was far from over. Amidst the chaos of that fateful day, loud shouts erupted, condemning the house where the shooting took place as belonging to Guizot. Threats poured down like a relentless hailstorm, raw with menace and determination. The attackers openly swore vengeance, not only against Guizot himself, but also with an ominous promise. If Admiral Coligny succumbed to his wounds, retribution would be swift and unforgettable. The very air seemed to crackle with the scent of impending war, as if a new conflict was imminent. Soon afterward, the injured admiral was visited by none other than King Charles IX himself, accompanied by his mother, Catherine de Medici, his brother Henry of Navarre, and the entire royal court. Enraged beyond measure, the king leaned over Coligny's bed, invoking his paternal authority to describe him as a father figure, emphasizing that his wounds, though inflicted on him, were in truth a royal pain. Charles IX swore to divine witnesses that he would seek vengeance so fiercely that the memory of this act of violence would endure for all eternity. Without delay, he ordered an immediate investigation into the attack, sealing off the city gates to prevent the assassin's escape. To ensure the security of the residents, he even assigned a detachment of his personal guards to guard Coligny's house, ostensibly to protect it from any further assault. However, As history later revealed, this measure was also intended to monitor who came and went from the house. The true identity of the mastermind behind the attack, however, remained shrouded in mystery. Many, including the Queen of Navarre and numerous historians, pointed to the Guises, who had both motive due to familial and political conflicts, and opportunity as the house and the horse were in their possession. Yet, the question lingered: acted alone, or was there more behind this conspiracy? Contemporary voices and later researchers widely believed that Catherine de Medici was the real puppet master behind it all. For her, killing Coligny would serve multiple strategic purposes simultaneously: eliminate a dangerous political rival, derail her hated war with Spain, and perhaps most cunningly, ignite a deadly rivalry between the opposing factions of Huguenots and Guises. Such a conflict would weaken their forces against each other, allowing the crown to remain above the fray. Some historians also suggest the involvement of the Duke of Anjou, adding another layer to this complex intrigue. A different theory hints at a Spanish trace. King Philip II of Spain, who regarded Coligny as his foremost enemy, could have been the one orchestrating the assault. Still, whatever the plan's origin, it failed. Coligny survived, but this failure proved catastrophic. Far from resolving tensions, the failed assassination only intensified the crisis. Rampant anger among the Huguenots, driven by the desire for swift justice, demanded action from the king. They issued threats. Unless the Guises were punished, they would take the law into their own hands. In this deadly game of political chess, the conspirators, whether Catherine, the Guises, or both, found themselves in an unavoidable trap. Their crime was on the brink of being exposed. In the resulting panic, and in the face of imminent retaliation, they resorted to a reckless step that transformed the botched political assassination into one of history's greatest tragedies. It was the evening of Saturday, the 23rd of August, and Paris was suffocating from the scorching heat and rising dread. Inside the Queen Mother's chambers at the Louvre, an atmosphere thick with panic prevailed. The investigation, fervently demanded by the king, was closing in, threatening to unearth the conspirators. The Huguenots gathered in Paris were furious. Their leaders, including Coligny's son-in-law, and La Rochefoucauld, openly speaking of their intentions. Rumours swirled that some 400 noble Huguenots had vowed revenge against the Guises, even if it meant storming the Louvre itself. Queen Catherine de Medici, King Henry of Navarre, and their closest advisors, what was then called the cabinet, knew that their time was rapidly running out. They understood that the walls around their plans were collapsing and chaos was imminent. According to the plans, immediate action was required. There could be no delay. It was during that critical night, in a secret council held within the opulent walls of the Tuileries Palace, that a fateful and drastic decision was made. Historians continue to debate the finer details of that night, yet the overarching narrative remains clear. The original scheme was likely limited in scope. Its primary goal was to crush the opposition by eliminating key figures, mainly the Huguenot leaders like Coligny and several dozen other influential and dangerous heads of the Protestant faction, thus ensuring the political movement would be effectively crippled and preventing any chance of retaliation. Such a measure, albeit brutal, was considered within the bounds of political expediency for that era, reflecting the harsh realities of power struggles in turbulent times. However, as fear and panic grew among the participants, what began as a calculated plot began to morph into something far more monstrous. Rumours suggest that figures like Henri de Guise, or perhaps the ruthless Duke of Anjou, proposed to extend the slaughter beyond the designated leaders. Instead of limiting their strike to the top echelons, they contemplated unleashing violence upon all Huguenots, assembled within Paris, a city effectively caught in a trap, vulnerable and exposed. There was a cynical saying of the time that the dead do not bite, meant to justify a devilish idea, to wipe out the entire Protestant leadership in one swift, decisive blow while they were all gathered in one place. The lure of striking such a crippling total blow was undeniably compelling, yet executing such a plan required the king's explicit approval. This need for royal consent set the stage for the dramatic psychological struggle of that night. Catherine de Medici and her advisors approached King Charles I, presenting themselves as his saviours, revealing a supposed terrible conspiracy. They told him that the Huguenots were preparing to ignite an insurrection, planning to slaughter the entire royal family and seize control of the throne. To reinforce their argument, they painted vivid pictures of chaos, violence, and anarchy that could engulf the kingdom. Sounding the alarm about the impending threat, they insisted there was no time for deliberation. Either they struck first that very night, or all of them would be ruthlessly murdered tomorrow. King Charles I was left in utter turmoil. He wavered between his loyalty to his father, King Henry II, and the terrifying threats voiced by his mother. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He shouted, wept, and refused to believe the severity of what was being told him. Yet the weight of pressure was overwhelming. According to certain accounts, Catherine, perhaps aware of his indecision, threatened that she would leave with his brother into exile, abandoning the young king to face the deadly consequences alone. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of agonizing hesitation, the king's nerves broke. He was seized by a furious, almost uncontrollable rage. The Duke of Anjou later recounted that Charles suddenly sprang to his feet and, swearing by God's name, declared that if they believed it necessary to kill Admiral Coligny, then he too wished it, along with all Huguenots in France, to ensure that no one could later accuse him of sympathy or defeatism. He ordered their extermination, repeating his command with ferocious insistence. The authenticity of this famous declaration remains debated among historians, but what is certain is this: the king's resolve shattered, and he gave his consent. Whether he fully understood the implications at that moment is another question. Perhaps he thought the decision was limited only to the leaders, just as the advisors had suggested. Nevertheless, that fatal word was spoken, and the machinery of death was instantly set into motion with relentless inevitability. Immediate orders were dispatched. Henri de Guy was summoned, entrusted with the critical task of assassinating Coligny, while the burgomaster of Paris received directives to close the city gates, pull shut the chains across the walls, and mobilize the city's militia. The military captains and militia leaders were instructed to assemble their men, awaiting a signal to begin. The killers' distinctive marks were to be white crosses adorning their hats and white armbands, serving as silent signals for the assassin's identity. The crucial moment, the signal for the slaughter to commence, was to be the toll of the bell from the Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois church, situated next to the Louvre. The ominous clang of that bell would mark the start of a massacre that would leave an indelible scar on the history of France, an event born from fear, manipulation, and the devastating consequences of a ruler's broken resolve. The tragic event was scheduled to unfold in the early morning hours, precisely at 3 o'clock, just before dawn. Paris lay motionless, cloaked in an eerie silence, its streets and courtyards awaiting the terrible coming storm. Unaware of the impending horror, the aristocrats residing within the walls of the Louvre Regnier's palace prepared for sleep, perhaps expecting only another peaceful night. A few of them, including the King of Navarre and the Prince of Condé, had chosen to spend the night within the palace itself, while others had retired to their private mansions in the surrounding neighbourhoods, oblivious to the ominous plans taking shape around them. Among the key figures on that fateful night was Ambroise Paré, a renowned surgeon and a Huguenot by faith, who served as the personal physician to the king. In a carefully calculated move, King Charles I had him confined in one of the palace's chambers, effectively confining him to prevent involvement in the chaos, an attempt to shelter him from the bloodshed. Yet, for thousands of others, this night was destined to become their last. The city, shrouded in a deceptive stillness, masked the violence and destruction that loomed just beneath the surface. It was a silence that served as the calm before the storm, a false tranquility before the carnage. At around 3 o'clock in the morning of August 24th, on the feast day of St. Bartholomew, that fragile peace was shattered abruptly. A deep, thunderous clang of the church bell from Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang out across Paris, a sound that normally signalled the start of morning prayers for the devout. But on this night, that familiar toll transformed into an ominous signal, warning of an imminent slaughter. The massacre erupted in a brutal, coordinated assault, with the first target being Admiral Coligny, a prominent Huguenot leader. A troop of men, led personally by Henri de Guise, approached his residence on Béthisy Street, while Guise and other noblemen waited in the courtyard. A group of mercenaries, under the command of a Czech mercenary named Bem, stormed the house. The mercenaries swiftly subdued the relatively small group of guards. With ease, Bem and his men forced entry into the Admiral's bedroom. Though Coligny had previously been wounded and was already aware of the danger, he faced his assailants with calm dignity. He called out to Bem, urging him to show respect for his age and frailty. However, mercy was in short supply that night. Bem thrust his sword into Coligny's chest, delivering a fatal wound, while the others finished him off with knives. Following the violent execution, on Guise's order, Coligny's body was tossed out of the window into the courtyard below. Guise approached the corpse, disdainfully wiped blood from his face to confirm the identity, and then kicked the body in a gesture of contempt. He declared that the slaughter had started well and that they should continue. The assassination of the Admiral served as a signal for action. Simultaneously, chaos erupted in multiple locations throughout the city. One of the most horrifying and treacherous scenes unfolded within the walls of the Louvre itself. The noble Huguenots, who had been staying in the palace as guests of the king, were abruptly awakened and forced out into the courtyard. Here, unarmed and bewildered, they encountered squads of Swiss guardsmen who immediately fell upon them with ruthless violence, slaughtering every single one. Some were murdered outright in the palace corridors, blood spilling across the marble floors as the violence spiraled into an uncontrollable nightmare. Among those caught in the carnage were the future King Henry III of Navarre and the young Duke of Condé. Although they managed to survive the initial onslaught, their lives were threatened, and they were compelled to convert to Catholicism under duress, renouncing their faith to escape death. Queen Margaret of Valois, only a few years old, later recounted the harrowing nights in her memoirs. She had no foreknowledge of the conspiracy and awoke to screams and chaos filling the palace. She remembered seeing a wounded Huguenot nobleman running into her chamber, pursued by 4 royal guards. She rushed to protect him, and it was only thanks to the intervention of the captain of the guard that both she and the nobleman were spared from immediate death. From the Grand Palace of the Louvre, the slaughter spilled out into the streets of Paris. The troops of the Duke of Anjou, Guise, and other Catholic noblemen, along with armed city militia and frenzied mobs, rushed through the city on prearranged lists, seeking out their Huguenot neighbours. They broke down doors with axes, dragged people from their beds, and mercilessly killed women, children, and the elderly alike. The city streets became a scene of chaos and terror, filled with screams, moans, the clatter of weapons, and deafening shouts from the enraged crowds, who seemed to have lost all sense of mercy or reason amid the bloodshed. This night of unprecedented bloodshed, orchestrated with brutal precision, marked one of the darkest chapters in French history. It was a night when trust was shattered and fear turned into chaos that would scar Paris forever. The city was plunged into darkness as the lanterns were extinguished, leaving the streets shrouded in shadows. In this ominous blackness, chaos surged forward, illuminated only by flickering torchlight and distant fires that burned with an unyielding glow. What transpired was not merely a political assassination or a violent act, but rather an eruption of accumulated hatred simmering within the populace. A violent outburst fueled by a potent mix of religious fanaticism, long-standing grievances, and primal instincts. The frenzy was relentless. The mobs pressed on with even greater ferocity. Joining the ranks of the attackers were thousands of ordinary Parisians, craftsmen, shopkeepers, apprentices, and impoverished beggars, each swept up in the bloodshed. For many of them, this was not solely a sacred conflict against heretics, but a golden opportunity to settle old scores with neighbours, to rid themselves of burdensome creditors, and most lucratively, to indulge in looting. Among the targets of this brutal rampage were the Damaguno family, prominent jewellers, merchants, and artisans, many of whom had amassed significant wealth. Their homes and possessions were subjected to complete plunder, as perpetrators tore clothing and jewellery from the dying and the dead. Within this sea of blood and destruction, a complex world of heroes and monsters emerged. Some Catholics, risking their own lives, secretly sheltered Huguenots, those considered heretics and enemies of the faith, thus acting virtuous in the chaos. Yet these acts of bravery were few. The majority of participants revelled in the bloodshed, driven by rage and frenzy rather than conviction. The corpse of Admiral Coligny became a symbol of savage brutality, mutilated and subjected to the most heinous acts of humiliation. The crowd decapitated him, severing his head, arms, and genitals with merciless hands. The lifeless body was dragged through the streets amid jeers, then hung by the legs on the Montfaucon gibbet as a gruesome trophy. His head was later preserved and sent as a macabre war prize to Rome, a grotesque symbol of the violence inflicted. The slaughter continued through the entire night and into the following day. Streets were blocked with fallen bodies, and blood gushed through open sewers, staining the city deeply. According to eyewitnesses, the streets resembled rivers of crimson, strewn with corpses that floated downstream, carried along by the flow of the bloodied tide. The exact death toll in Paris remains uncertain. Estimates range from a few dozen to as many as 5,000 victims. Over mere days, nearly the entire upper class of the Huguenot aristocracy was slaughtered, sparing only a handful of princes of the blood. While the Protestant leadership was decimated and demoralized, the true horror was only beginning to unfold. From Paris, this wave of bloodshed spread rapidly across France. News of the massacre travelled with astonishing speed, carried by royal couriers who rode swiftly to every corner of the kingdom, bearing official letters from King Charles III. The content of these royal messages varied over time. Initially, the king expressed sadness and regret, describing the killings as a tragic flare-up of violence caused by the long-standing hostility between the Guises and the Chatillon families, and assuring his subjects of his sorrow. However, as days passed and it became evident that the extent of the violence could no longer be concealed, the king took responsibility for the events. In his speech before the Paris Parliament on August 26, he declared that his order for the execution of the Huguenots was meant to prevent a terrible conspiracy against his reign and his family. Thus, the massacre was reframed not as an act of religious fanaticism, but as a necessary act of state self-defense. Such official approval of the killings effectively served as an indulgence, sanctioning further violence and allowing fanatic mobs and brigands to rampage unchecked in the provinces. Across the entire country, waves of pogroms erupted, a phenomenon historians have called the Holy Week fever. Yet, the character and scale of these massacres varied remarkably from city to city. The violence was seldom a centrally coordinated operation. In some places, the mob violence broke out spontaneously, triggered by reports from Paris that spread like wildfire. In other locales, local ultra-Catholic leaders or provincial governors actively incited the massacres, leveraging existing tensions and religious zeal to stoke the flames of chaos. In certain cities, local authorities, both Catholic and moderate Huguenot leaders, managed to prevent the outbreak of mass bloodshed, demonstrating that, under certain circumstances, restraint and negotiation could still bear fruit even amid turbulent times. However, the most brutal and devastating pogroms took place in regions with large Protestant populations and long-standing histories of religious strife. For instance, the massacre in Orléans began on August 26th and continued for several days, during which over 1,000 Huguenots lost their lives. These killings were often accompanied by widespread looting and violence, turning the streets into scenes of chaos and barbarity. In Lyon, a major commercial and financial hub, the massacre was particularly ruthless. It started on the 31st of August, with Huguenots initially arrested and imprisoned. Yet, under the influence of monks and mobs incited by religious extremists, the imprisoned were soon stormed and murdered en masse. The bodies of the victims were thrown into the rivers Rhône and Saône, victims' blood staining the waters and shocking all who witnessed the carnage. The death toll in Lyon is estimated to have ranged from about 800 to perhaps as many as 1,800 lives lost. In Normandy's capital, Rouen, similar atrocities unfolded mid-September, following a pattern seen elsewhere. Arrests preceded the bloodshed, which claimed several hundred lives. Blood was spilled in many other towns: Bordeaux, Toulouse, Montreux, and numerous smaller municipalities, where the violent scenes echoed the horrors of Paris, marked by murders, plundering, and desecration of corpses. The process of the massacres was remarkably consistent across different locations. Initially, rumour-mongering spread false reports of royal orders to eliminate heretics, fueling panic and violence. Subsequently, local militias, or mobs, often led by Catholic zealots, began hunts for Huguenots, resulting in brutal killings. The violence was characterized by extreme cruelty. Victims were drowned, hanged, or hacked apart. Sometimes religious hatred merely served as a facade for personal vendettas or outright theft. Many Catholics seized the chaos as an opportunity to settle scores with their Huguenot creditors or rival craftsmen, adding a layer of greed to the already savage violence. Nevertheless, there were notable exceptions. Several royal governors and city officials, risking royal displeasure or even punishment, refused to carry out the bloody orders or actively sabotage them. A famous example, though possibly apocryphal, is the response of Vincent de Hort, the governor of Bayonne, to the king's command. When asked about the order to execute heretics, he allegedly replied that he had informed the city's residents and garrison about the royal edict and found there only good citizens and brave soldiers, but not a single executioner. Similarly, thanks to the courage of the mayor, Nantes avoided the massacre altogether, and in Provence, where the governor was a Huguenot, the conflict passed with little bloodshed. The exact number of victims during the Bartholomew's night across France remains a matter of debate among historians. Estimates vary between 10,000 and 30,000 lives. Regardless of the precise figures, this event represented a demographic and psychological catastrophe for the nation. Within mere weeks, French Protestantism was effectively decapitated and drained of vitality. Thousands of Huguenots were murdered, and tens of thousands, overwhelmed by fear, fled the country in search of refuge in Geneva, England, and the Dutch Republic. Many survivors, shattered and traumatized, felt compelled to convert to Catholicism under the weight of horror and despair. It appeared that Catherine de Medici and the Guises had achieved their aim. The Huguenot faction was shattered and diminished. Yet this victory proved to be Pyrrhic. The massacre did not put an end to the religious wars. In fact, it intensified the hostilities, making them even more bitter and unyielding. News of the Parisian slaughter spread swiftly through Europe, eliciting a wave of shock, horror, and, disturbingly, some degree of jubilation among certain factions. The reactions across continental courts reflected the deep religious and political fissures that divided the continent, some expressing condemnation, others viewing the violence as a tragic yet perhaps inevitable upheaval. In the aftermath, many recognized that the bloodshed had only deepened the divisions and prolonged the cycle of conflict, turning the French wars of religion into a relentless struggle that would persist for years to come. The news of the massacre in the Catholic camp was met with overwhelming enthusiasm and joy. When the Pope's nuncio in Rome delivered the grim tidings, Pope Gregory XI was so overcome with happiness that he ordered a special Thanksgiving prayer to be held. A commemorative medal was struck in honour of the event. Its reverse side depicted a profile portrait of the Pope, while the other featured an angel wielding a sword, symbolically punishing heretics. The renowned artist Giorgio Vasari was commissioned to create a series of frescoes inside the Vatican, illustrating scenes of the killings in Calais and the subsequent slaughter. It is crucial to understand that this jubilant reaction was not simply due to the scale of the killings, but rather stemmed from the official narrative presented by the French court. For Pope Gregory, this was not a brutal massacre of innocent civilians, but the suppression of a horrifying conspiracy of heretics against the legitimate monarchy, a triumph of the Catholic faith over treachery. The celebration was even more fervent in Madrid. King Philip II, who was the second most powerful monarch in Europe and a staunch supporter of Catholicism, reportedly broke into laughter for the first time in his life upon hearing the news. According to reports from the French envoy, the king considered the death of Admiral Coligny and the destruction of the Guisard party to be the greatest victory, a divine favour that shattered the plans of a French invasion into the Netherlands and eliminated the primary threat to his empire. He expressed his congratulations to King Charles IX and Queen Catherine de Medici, describing their actions as a grand deed that brought glory to God and benefited all Christendom. Meanwhile, reactions across Protestant countries were strikingly different. News from Paris instilled a wave of horror, fury, and lamentation. Thousands of Protestant refugees, fleeing the violence and bloodshed, carried with them chilling tales of their ordeal, recounting nightmares of death and chaos. In Geneva, the stronghold of Calvinism, a day of national mourning and fasting was declared. The eminent theologian Theodore de Besse, a successor of John Calvin, authored fiery pamphlets denouncing the French rulers' cruelty and tyranny. In England, Queen Elizabeth I and her court were deeply shocked and disturbed when the French ambassador, Lhomme Fenelon, arrived to present the official version of events, he was met with an icy silence from the assembled courtiers. The Queen herself, a master of political manoeuvring, publicly condemned the massacre, yet refrained from severing diplomatic relations with France, recognising that maintaining diplomatic ties was a necessary counterbalance to Spain's power. Despite this, nationwide protests erupted in England, with anti-French and anti-Catholic demonstrations spreading across the land. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Maximilian II, who was known for his moderate views and the son-in-law of Charles IX, was horrified by his father-in-law's actions. In a private letter, he expressed shame and disbelief that the emperor could have sanctioned such a disgraceful deed, lamenting that it was a stain on their reputation. It was within this atmosphere of widespread horror, outrage, and moral indignation that the infamous legend of Catherine de Medici was born. Within hundreds of pamphlets, poems, and engravings circulated throughout Protestant Europe, she was portrayed as a diabolical figure, an embodiment of evil, a treacherous Italian woman, a student of Machiavelli, an assassin, and the chief architect of the slaughter. Accusations ranged from her being a poisoner to her masterminding the entire massacre. She was blamed for every mortal sin and alleged to have harboured the most monstrous schemes. Although this legend was largely exaggerated and often unfair, it became deeply ingrained in popular memory and significantly shaped her historical image for generations to come. The massacre also had profound ideological repercussions, fueling ongoing conflicts and shaping the perceptions of political and religious enemies across Europe. She delivered a devastating blow to the very idea of divine right as the foundation of royal authority in France. Prior to the year 1572, the Huguenots, or French Protestants, generally claimed that their struggle was not against the king himself, but rather against his unruly and misguided advisors, what they called the Guises. They maintained that their conflict was rooted in defending true faith and justice, rather than challenging royal sovereignty. However, this comfortable fiction was shattered when the king personally assumed responsibility for the murder of his subjects, thereby exposing the fragility of the monarch's divine legitimacy. In the aftermath, a radical new political doctrine emerged among Protestant thinkers, one that questioned absolute monarchy itself. Known as the theory of tyrannicide or monarchomacy, this revolutionary idea gained ground among certain writers such as François Hotman and Philippe Duplessis Mornay. In their tracts, they argued convincingly that royal authority was not an innate, unquestionable divine gift, but rather a social contract between the ruler and the people. When a monarch breaches this trust or becomes a tyrant, the governed possess both the right and the moral duty to resist, and, if necessary, to overthrow him. These revolutionary principles, born amid the flames of the St. Bartholomew's Night, would go on to exert profound influence on subsequent upheavals across Europe, inspiring major revolutions in England, America, and ultimately culminating in the French Revolution itself. The bloodshed on the streets of Paris therefore inadvertently sowed the seeds of these future rebellions, though their architects could hardly have anticipated such far-reaching consequences. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Night did not bring peace either, quite the opposite. It marked the beginning of a darker, more ferocious, and prolonged era of religious warfare. The surviving Huguenots, seized by terror and bitterness, reached a point where they believed there was nothing left to lose. Their struggle, once purely religious, had transformed into a desperate fight for survival. Within mere months, the fourth of the series of religious wars erupted, ignited in towns and cities in the south and west of France, places like La Rochelle and Montpellier, settlements that refused to capitulate and became fortified bastions of resistance against the royal armies. for the main figures embroiled in this tragic drama. Vengeance was swift and inevitable. King Charles IX, haunted by the violence, could never fully recover from the psychological trauma inflicted by the massacre. Nightmares plagued him, and he often saw rivers of blood and the screams of dying men in his mind's eye. His already fragile health deteriorated rapidly, and he died in 1574 at the tender age of 23, a victim of tuberculosis. His death left his brother, Henry of Anjou, to inherit a kingdom riddled with chaos. Henry II, the former Duke of Anjou and one of the chief orchestrators of the carnage, came to power during a nation torn apart by the so-called War of Three Henrys, namely Henry II himself, Henry d'Angoulême, sometimes called the Duke of Angoulême, and Henry of Navarre. His rule was marked by violent factional struggles and brutal reprisals, until, ultimately, his life was cut short by a fanatic monk. Henry d'Angoulême, widely regarded as the chief executioner of St. Bartholomew's night, was also murdered by the very same Henry II in an astonishing act of political violence. Meanwhile, Catherine de Medici, the influential Queen Mother, passed away in 1589, just months before witnessing the tragic demise of her beloved last son, an outcome she had long dreaded. Her life's work, the fragile attempt at balancing religious factions, seemed to crumble in her final days. The twisted irony of history lies in the fact that ultimately the crown of France was inherited by the very individual who had been the target of the infamous massacre. Following the death of the childless Henry II, the only legitimate heir to the throne was Henry of Navarre, a leader of the Huguenots. To ascend the throne and to try to unify the fragmented kingdom, he publicly converted to Catholicism, supposedly declaring, in a famous but likely apocryphal phrase, that Paris is well worth a mass. Reigning as King Henry I of Navarre, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting the Huguenots religious freedom and civil rights, thus attempting to bring peace and stability to a country torn apart by decades of religious violence. This decree in many ways embodied the long-sought policy of religious tolerance that Catherine de Medici had ardently aspired to achieve for many years. Yet, it took a devastating series of 26 bloody years, marked by relentless wars and brutal conflicts, before France finally reached the very point where these hopes could be realized. The St. Bartholomew's Night, a horrifying and tragic episode in French history, left an indelible scar on the collective memory of the nation. It became a grim symbol of how deeply religious faith could distort into a dangerous ideology of hatred, and how political expediency often pushed entire communities toward mass violence and slaughter. This dark event vividly demonstrated how easily a mob, incited by fear, lies, and manipulation, could transform into a wild, unrestrained beast, an uncontrollable force of destruction. Moreover, the night of violence raised profound and unsettling questions that continue to resonate through time. Where lies the boundary between genuine faith and destructive fanaticism? What moral responsibility does those in power bear when they allow bloodshed among their own people? And is it possible to forge lasting peace upon a foundation stained with betrayal and the remains of slaughter? The events of August the 24th, 1572, are not simply an entry in a history textbook. They serve as an eternal warning, a warning about the fragile nature of civilization and the lurking darkness within the human soul, an abyss that can be stirred with a single call to violence. The tolling of bells summoning to murder in the name of God is a chilling reminder that such calls can echo within each one of us. Thank you for dedicating your time to explore this dark and instructive tragedy of European history. If this journey through time has piqued your interest, consider following the channel to stay informed about future stories, long and detailed, and to continue discovering history's pivotal moments and turning points. Your attention and engagement are the greatest support for our project.